Now we'll move on to our speaker panel session. So in this session, look, we're just opening it up via the chat for questions to any one of the speakers. So Lizette, how are we going for questions at this time?
We've got some fantastic questions, and I'm going to kick it off with a question for Taz. We've got a question around STCs and how they apply to heat pumps. Is that something that you're able to speak to?
Yep. Yeah. So basically, heat pumps. The whole idea is that they're a super efficient way of heating up your hot water. So as sort of David had mentioned earlier, with your way you can get rid of an old electric unit, you can replace that with a heat pump, and that will create VEECs, which obviously brings the cost down. Additionally to that, because it's falls under the heat pump scheme, actually generates an amount of STCs. So different types of actual heat pumps will generate a different amount. The ones we use, they'll generate about 25 to 28 STCs. Because obviously the government, and that's through the federal government, they're saying that's obviously going to drop that energy cost, so they want to actually help people, help fund it basically. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Great, thanks Taz.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Taz. The next question I'm going to put towards you, Scott. I've had a question around upgrade finance for commercial solar installations for people who are leasing their premises. Can you speak a little bit to how a tenant might be able to get started with looking at this type of finance?
Okay, great. The first thing is to have a project. Talk to Taz about scoping up a project and understanding what the economics of that project could be for your business. So once you've done that, through that process, have some early engagement with your landlord, because ultimately what you're going to be asking them is to say, well, we will happily make the repayments on this EUA, and in the case of solar, we'll put solar on the roof, we'll pay for it as a tenant, and you'll have the solar assets on your roof. Now, once if you move out during that period, they'll have the benefit of those solar panels staying on the roof there. The tenant won't take them away, but the future tenants will get the benefit of that and make the building more attractive as well. So it's about a collaboration of working through a tenant, because tenants are driven by cash flow. In this scenario, this is something that they don't sign the contract themselves. It's a contract between a landlord, council, and ourselves as a lender, but this puts cash into their business, and the benefit is that effectively a tenant, from a landlord's perspective, is paying for an improvement to their building. So it's a win-win solution there, where there's opportunities to come in. And the benefit of an EUA is that there's no other form of agreement that needs to be amended here, so you don't need to update the lease, you don't need to have a separate agreement. It makes it really easy to engage with your landlord and get the benefits for both landlords and tenants.
So Scott, in theory, you could use an environmental upgrade agreement to not only just access upgrade finance, but also help sort through some of the issues associated with if you wanted to access the solar for business rebate too.
Yes, so I should say, even with with VEECs, solar for business rebate, and all the other subsidy that's available out there, there is, depending on the size of your system, there's always a residual amount that a business would need to pay, and we can fund that residual amount entirely. So the net impact of that is that you're getting free money from the government, and long-term finance for us, making the cash flows even greater to the project. So this is not grant money. This is a finance mechanism provided by us and enabled by the local council, and that absolutely can be used in parallel with any other government subsidy.
Cool, great. Lizette, I've got a couple of questions for David that I might flick towards him. First one's from Fran.
Fantastic.
Fran wants to know the energy compare rebate, is this something that we need to add? What's the details around it, and will businesses be eligible? If not, she thinks it's going to be very useful for businesses. If not, is this something that we can advocate for to state government and SV?
Well, yeah. I mean, the advocacy thing, I think you can always advocate for things like this. Whilst we were, I was having a bit of a look in the background. The $250 is definitely just for residential only
Okay.
in that announcement for 1 July. But that said, again, that energy compare, I mean, the website actually has residential and business, and you never quite know what happens in the long term. If you look at Solar Victoria as an example of that, which was a successful residential program that then, moved into business. So it's definitely 1 July 250 for households, but yeah, if there was strong feeling about that, I certainly would be advocating on that one.
Great, Fran, you've got your marching orders. So next question. Alana has asked, how many businesses renting have accessed the SolarVic rebate?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have the information, and I couldn't find it whilst I read that question, and whilst in the last few minutes. I could probably find out if that's helpful. Certainly, in terms of I think there's the second part of that's about the hurdles, the barriers.
Yep.
There's certainly agreement that has to be reached between owner and landlord. The owner and the tenant as part of this. So there's an additional agreement, has to have a bit of a look at the lease. And really that's for both now and into the future. So potentially if the tenant moves on, just who's got responsibility and ownership for what, who maintains what when, and those kind of things. So that's kind of your main hurdle. But I've certainly heard of it working. So, but I couldn't talk to how many yet, but I can certainly follow that up.
Great, thanks, David. Lizette, I think we've got Richard who would like to ask a question from the floor. Should we allow that? I think we should.
Okay, we'll make an exception for you, Richard.
Oh, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me, guys? Yep. Okay. Yeah, Scott, I was keen to know, in a situation where there's a solar install then on a commercial premises and the tenant is leasing and leaves the building at the end of their lease term, is there an obligation for the incoming tenant to take over the arrangement for some reason they may not want to or whatever? And is there an obligation for the landlord to continue the repayments while the property is vacant? So if the property was vacant, say for 6 months or 12 months or whatever, while there was the landlord was looking for a replacement tenant, what happens to the payments during that period of vacancy, and then what happens when the new tenant comes in, should they not wish to? You would assume that they probably would want to take advantage of the situation to get the cheaper power, but if for some reason they don't need it or don't want to.
Yeah, so, some good questions there. So as it happens today, landlords currently wear those vacancy risks. So tenant moves out, they've got to move another tenant in. The benefit here is that when you have, from a landlord's perspective, when you have solar on your roof, you make your property more attractive to future incoming tenants because the total cost of occupancy there reduces. Now, from a tenant's perspective, and there is a commercial negotiation around a lease, right? So the answer to your question about while it's vacant, does the landlord have the obligation to pay? Yes. But if you kind of look at what is that marginal risk, if you basically look at the case example there from Bass and Flinders, the feed-in tariff is 6.7 cents, and our rough numbers for an EUA repayment is about 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour, including maintenance, which basically is 0.8 cents per kilowatt hour is the net risk if all of that energy is being fed back into the tenant, into the grid while the property is vacant. So the net cost is actually quite marginal. And from the landlord's perspective, you've got a better property. Now, from an incoming tenant's perspective, there's a negotiation around the lease, and that would be a topic of discussion. Should I pay the environmental upgrade charge or otherwise? Now, the tenant should come in and say, you know, I don't want to pay that. And the landlord say, oh, that's fine. Well, we can just, wear that through the rent. Now, what that means is the rent probably goes up $1 or $2 a square metre or something like that. Now, what that means is from a tenant's perspective, they've actually suddenly rentalised the repayments or the benefits of solar. Now, under a lease, you might have a 5 by 5 year kind of term. That means that $2 or $3 per square metres will always go up by CPI or market rent reviews for the full 15 years. Whereas an environmental upgrade agreement will stop and will stop at the end of the EUA. So it's always better to fund from a tenant's perspective these types of projects through this form of finance because it stops rather than paying additional through the rent and rentalising those costs. But I do take it down to it is a commercial negotiation between a landlord and tenant around the lease time.
Great, thanks, Scott.
Great question.
Lizette, I want to ask Holly a question really quickly. So, Holly, we mentioned before that the business is growing and expanding, and your energy consumption is increasing all the time. What are your plans moving forward now for dealing with that?
Yeah, so I guess that the challenge that we've got at the moment is that with our new gin still, we usually need to be turning it on around 6 a.m. and that's well before we can get the benefit of the solar. Ben and Taz from Dunton Group have recommended that we switch the still on a little later in the day, but it just doesn't work for us from a production perspective. So the next step for us, we actually applied for a separate grant that was available. I can't remember the name of the grant, I'm sorry, but still waiting to hear back. Applied for a grant to invest in some batteries. So we would like to get a couple of 13.5 kilowatt batteries, so 27 kilowatt total, that will be able to hold some of the benefits of the solar so that we can draw down on that before the sun comes out, really. So that'll be the next steps for us.
Great. And
that I think the net effect of that, Ben did some analysis for us. So at the moment, after investing in the solar. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say it'll halve our total annual bill again if we get those batteries.
Great, cool. Thanks, Holly. Appreciate it. Lizette, back to you. Who's up next?
I'm going to throw to Nicci. We've got a couple of questions. One all the way from Western Australia, which is fantastic, just about getting councils on board, or even just getting where there's a gap. So whether that's a council that's not offering it, or in the case of Western Australia, who don't offer upgrade finance at all. How do you think councils and different government bodies can help get the wheels turning to enable environmental upgrade finance?
Right, from an outside perspective, lobbying councils, is that how I take the question? From
the perspective of an individual who is maybe a business owner, and also from the perspective of someone who is within council, what are some of the concrete actions that we could take to help get environmental upgrade finance to be offered in more council areas and more states in Australia, in your opinion?
Yep. Well, I think the first approach would be to the climate change team or equivalent, whether that be a sustainability team, to try to get them on board. Showcase some of the examples from Victoria and New South Wales looking at those business cases, because, you know, I think the evidence is pretty clear that environmental upgrade finance does work and it does have a great benefit to businesses. But the crunch is to get it through the finance team. So to then get that sustainability team to show the evidence to the finance team, once they're in agreement, then the wheels can start turning, and that discussion can be had as to whether AUF can be offered in that state. But yeah, you'll always have the climate change team on board, but it's a matter of showing that evidence to get everybody else within the organisation on board as well. So those business cases are where that sort of decision will be made, I think.
Great, thanks, Nicci. Liz, I think we've got time for one more question. Did you want to pick one from the list in the chat, or am I allowed to ask one?
I'll let you ask one, Ed, and just letting everyone know that the questions in the chat that we haven't gotten to today, we will follow up with after the session in an email. So if you haven't heard from us about your question, don't worry, we'll get to it and make sure that you have an answer.
So Taz, if a business is interested in doing something, where should they get started?
There we go, yeah. So, I mean, the most important thing is to reach out and find, I guess, a local reputable company, whether that be asking around and finding out who you can sort of in your local area, or, you know, send us an email and we can certainly, we know a lot of businesses in different areas that we can certainly point you in the right direction. But I guess it's about trying to gather all the pieces together that I mentioned that we did for Holly. So it's about having a site visit, having someone that really knows the products that they're putting in, can really look at your power bill and work out not only how solar is going to help you, but, you know, how, you know, you might have a business that you have residents come to your property. You might need to start thinking about EV chargers. That's going to push your consumption through the roof. So don't just think about what your consumption is now, think about where you're going to be in 12 months, 3 years, 5 years, because I guarantee you it'll look completely different when there's more EVs driving around. And if your business has the facilities for them to charge, then they're going to come to you. That's probably the next big step for where sort of, I guess, businesses are going to need to go to cater for that sort of stuff. But yeah, get a really good breakdown. Find out, do your research about the panels. Are the brands that you're putting in sustainable? Is the company you're using, are they sustainable? If that's the way that you're going down, like, really do your research and make sure that, you know, that your core values and their core values align, and then it should make it pretty seamless.
Great, excellent. Well, thanks a lot for that, Taz, much appreciated. And on that note, I might just thank everybody for attending. Thank the speakers. So David, Taz, Holly, Scott, Nicci, thank you very much for your contribution. I found this to be a very worthwhile session. I hope everyone else has too.